History 10, Chapter 6, Section 4, The American Revolution. The main idea is revolution. Enlightenment ideas helped spur the American colonies to shed British rule and create a new nation. Why it matters now. The Revolution created a republic, the United States of America, that became a model for many nations of the world, where we live right now. Terms and names. Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, checks and balances, federal system, Bill of Rights. Setting the stage. Philosophers such as Voltaire considered England's government the most progressive in Europe. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 had given England a constitutional monarchy. In essence, this meant that various laws limited the power of the English king. Despite the view of the philosophers, however, a growing number of England's colonists in North America accused England of tyrannical rule. Emboldened by Enlightenment ideas, they would attempt to overthrow what was then the mightiest power on earth and create their own nation. Britain and its American colonies. Throughout the 1600s and the 1700s, British colonists had formed a large and thriving settlement along the eastern shore of North America. When George III became the King of Great Britain in 1760, his North American colonies were growing by leaps and bounds. Their combined population soared from about 25,000 in 1700 to 2,150,000 in 1770. A nearly nine-fold increase. Economically, the colonies thrived on trade with the nations of Europe. Along with increasing population and prosperity, a new sense of identity was growing in the colonists' mind. By the mid-1700s, colonists had been living in America for nearly 150 years. Each of the 13 colonies had its own government, and people were used to a great degree of independence. Colonists saw themselves less as British and more as Virginians or Pennsylvanians. However, they were still British subjects and were expected to obey British law. In 1651, the British Parliament passed a trade law called the Navigation Act, and this and subsequent trade laws prevented colonists from selling their most valuable products to any country except Britain. In addition, colonists had to pay high taxes on imported French and Dutch goods. Nonetheless, Britain's policies benefited both the colonists and the motherland. Britain bought American raw materials for low prices and sold manufactured goods to the colonists. And despite various British trade restrictions, colonial merchants also thrived. But such a spirit of relative harmony, however, soon would change. Americans win independence. In 1754, war erupted on the North American continent between the English and the French. As you recall, the French had also colonized parts of North America throughout the 1600s and 1700s. The conflict was known as the French and Indian War. The name stems from the fact that the French enlisted numerous Native American tribes to fight on their side. The fighting lasted until 1763, when Britain and her colonists emerged victorious and seized nearly all French land in North America. The victory, however, only led to growing tensions between Britain and its colonists. In order to fight the war, Great Britain had run up a huge debt. Because American colonists benefited from Britain's victory, Britain expected the colonists to help pay the cost of the war. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. According to this law, colonists had to pay a tax to have an official stamp put on wills, deeds, newspapers, and other printed materials. American colonists were outraged. They had never paid taxes directly to the British government before. Colonial lawyers argued that the stamp tax violated colonists' natural rights, and they accused the government of taxation without representation. In Britain, citizens consented to taxes through their representatives in Parliament. The colonists, however, had no representatives in Parliament. Thus, they argued that they could not be taxed. Growing hostility leads to war. Over the next decade, hostility between the two sides increased. Some colonial leaders favored independence from Britain. In 1773, to protest an import tax on tea, a group of colonists dumped a large load of British tea into the Boston harbor. George III, infuriated by the Boston Tea Party, as it was called, ordered the British Navy to close the port of Boston. Such harsh tactics by the British made enemies of moderate colonists. In September 1774, representatives from every colony except Georgia gathered in Philadelphia to form the First Continental Congress. This group protested the treatment of Boston. When the king paid little attention to their complaints, the colonies decided to form the Second Continental Congress to debate their next move. On April 19, 1775, British soldiers and American militiamen exchanged gunfire on the village green in Lexington, Massachusetts. The fighting spread to nearby Concord. The Second Continental Congress voted to raise an army and organize for battle under the command of a Virginian named George Washington. American Revolution had begun. The influence of the Enlightenment. Colonial leaders used Enlightenment ideas to justify independence. The colonists had asked for the same political rights as people in Britain, they said, but the king had stubbornly refused. Therefore, the colonists were justified in rebelling against a tyrant who had broken the social contract. Before I change pages, we're going to bump up to the history makers. Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826. The author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, was a true figure of the Enlightenment. As a writer and statesman, he supported free speech, religious freedom, and other civil liberties. At the same time, he was also a slave owner. Jefferson was a man of many talents. He was an inventor as well as one of the great architects of early America. He designed the Virginia State Capitol building in Richmond and many buildings for the University of Virginia. Of all his achievements, Jefferson wanted to be most remembered for three: author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and founder of the University of Virginia. And back down to the bottom of 207. In July 1776, the Second Continental Congress issued the Declaration of Independence. This document, written by political leader Thomas Jefferson, turning the page, 208, was firmly based on the ideas of John Locke and the Enlightenment. The Declaration reflected these ideas in its eloquent argument for natural rights. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," states the beginning of the Declaration, "that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Since Locke had asserted that people had the right to rebel against an unjust ruler, the Declaration of Independence included a long list of George III's abuses. The document ended by declaring the colonies' separation from Britain. The colonies, the Declaration said, are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown. We're going to move up to the box at the very top of page 208. Changing idea, colonial attachment to Britain. The old idea. American colonists considered themselves to be subjects of the British rule, or the British king. But the new idea is, after a long train of perceived abuses by the king, the colonists asserted their right to declare independence. And back to the main text. Success for the colonists. The British were not about to let their colonies leave without a fight. Shortly after the publication of the Declaration of Independence, the two sides went to war. At first glance, the colonists seemed destined to go down in quick defeat. Washington's ragtag, poorly trained army faced the well-trained forces of the most powerful country in the world. In the end, however, the Americans won their war for independence. Several reasons explain the colonists' success. First, the Americans' motivation for fighting was much stronger than that of the British, since their army was defending their homeland. Second, the overconfident British generals made several mistakes. Third, time itself was on the side of the Americans. The British could win battle after battle as they did, but still lose the war. Fighting an overseas war 3,000 miles from London was terribly expensive. After a few years, tax-weary British citizens called for peace. Finally, the Americans did not fight alone. Louis XIV of France had little sympathy for the ideals of the American Revolution. However, he was eager to weaken France's rival, Britain. French entry into the war in 1778 was decisive. In 1781, combined forces of about 9,500 Americans and 7,800 French trapped a British army commanded by Lord Cornwallis near Yorktown, Virginia. Unable to escape, Cornwallis eventually surrendered. The Americans had shocked the world and won their independence. Page 209 is analyzing key concepts about democracy. We're going to skip that, but I recommend you reading it on your own. Moving on to page 210. Americans create a republic. Actually, bumping up to the global impact, we'll read about the French Revolution first and then go on. The American Revolution inspired the growing number of French people who sought reform in their own country. They saw the new government of the United States as the fulfillment of Enlightenment ideals and longed for such a government in France. The Declaration of Independence was widely circulated and admired in France. French officers like Marquis de Lafayette, who fought for American independence, captivated his fellow citizens with accounts of the war. One Frenchman remarked about this time period, "We talked of nothing but America." Less than a decade after the American Revolution ended, an armed struggle to topple the government would begin in France. And now back down to Americans create a republic. Shortly after declaring their independence, the 13 individual states recognized the need for a national government. As victory became certain, all 13 states ratified a constitution in 1781. This plan of government was known as the Articles of Confederation. The Articles established the United States as a republic, a government in which citizens rule through elected representatives. A weak national government. To protect their authority, the 13 states created a loose confederation in which they held most of the power. Thus, the Articles of Confederation deliberately created a weak national government. There were no executive or judicial branches. Instead, the Articles established only one body of government, the Congress. Each state, regardless of size, had one vote in Congress. Congress could declare war, enter into treaties, and coin money to make money. It had no power, however, to collect taxes or regulate trade. Passing new laws was difficult because laws needed the approval of 9 of the 13 states. These limits on the national government soon produced many problems. Although the new national government needed money to operate, it could only request contributions from the states. Angry Revolutionary War veterans bitterly complained that Congress still owed them back pay for their services. Meanwhile, several states issued their own money. Some states even put tariffs on goods from neighboring states. They charged for trading with neighboring states. A new constitution. Colonial leaders eventually recognized the need for a strong national government. In February 1787, Congress approved a constitutional convention to revise the Articles of the Confederation. The Constitutional Convention held its first sessions on May 25, 1787. The 55 delegates were experienced statesmen who were familiar with the political theories of Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. Although the delegates shared basic ideas on government, they sometimes disagreed on how to put them into practice. For almost 4 months, the delegates argued over important questions. Who should be represented in Congress? How many representatives should each state have? The delegates' deliberation produced not only compromises, but also new approaches to governing. Using the political ideas of the Enlightenment, the delegates created a new system of government, the federal system. Like Montesquieu, the delegates distrusted a powerful central government controlled by one person or group. They, therefore, established 3 separate branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. This setup provided a built-in system of checks and balances, with each branch checking the actions of the other 2. For example, the president received the power to veto legislation passed by Congress. However, the Congress could override a presidential veto with the approval of 2/3 of its members. Although the Constitution created a strong central government, it did not eliminate local governments. Instead, the Constitution held up a federal system, in which power was divided between national and state governments. The Bill of Rights. The delegates signed the new Constitution on September 17, 1787. In order to become law, however, the Constitution required approval by conventions in at least 9 of the 13 states. These conventions were marked by sharp debate. Supporters of the Constitution were called Federalists. They argued in their most famous work, the Federalist Papers, that the new government would provide a better balance between national and state powers. Their opponents, the Anti-Federalists, feared that the Constitution gave the central government too much power. They also wanted a Bill of Rights to protect the rights of individual citizens. In order to gain support, the Federalists promised to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. This promise cleared the way for approval. Congress formally added to the Constitution the 10 amendments known as the Bill of Rights. These amendments protected such basic rights as freedom of speech, press, assembly, and religion. Freedom of speech, press, assembly, and religion. Many of these rights had been advocated by Voltaire, Rousseau, and Locke. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights marked a turning point in the people's ideas about government. Both documents put Enlightenment ideas into practice. They expressed an optimistic view that reason and reform could prevail and that progress was inevitable. Such optimism swept across the Atlantic. However, the monarchies and the privileged class didn't give up power and position easily. As Chapter 7 explains, the struggle to attain the principles of the Enlightenment led to a violent revolution in France. Section 4, Assessment. Again, the terms and names for this unit are Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, Checks and Balances, Federal System, Bill of Rights. You can read the questions by yourself, I trust. I hope you enjoyed what did we read? Chapter 6. Alright, bye-bye.